Timothy Ministries. Today we're going to be looking at how God views sin. So to start out, we're going to look at what sin is. Sin is defined actually as an archery term that as anything that misses the mark. So anything that doesn't hit the bullseye in archery. And sin is anything that misses God's perfect plan for our lives and God's standards for how we should live. So with that, looking at who sins, everybody sins. If we look at Romans 3:23, it says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." Therefore, every single person, you, me, every pastor you've met, every single person you have ever met has sinned and is undeserving of the grace that God has for us. So none of us could ever reach the perfection that God has for us or reach the mark throughout our lives. So how does God view sin? God views sin as self-destructive and defiling. In Proverbs 8:36 it says, "But he who sins against me wrongs his own soul. All those who hate me love death." So looking at that verse, it says, he who sins against me wrongs his own soul. We are self-destructive and we defile ourselves when we sin. God also sees sin as bringing upon his own wrath. Ephesians 2:3 says, "Among whom we also once conducted ourselves in the lusts of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just as the others." So our sin understandably brings upon God's wrath on ourselves. It's kind of like when you disobey your parents. They still love you, but they're upset with you, and they're going to punish you. God also sees sin as separating and alienating. Hosea 5:6 says, "With their flocks and herds they shall go to seek out the Lord, but they will not find him. He has withdrawn himself from them." So when we sin, we're basically telling God, "I don't need you, your plan isn't as good as my plan." So when we say that to somebody, of course they're not going to stick around. So we separate ourselves and say, "God, I don't need you, I'm going to walk away from you and do my thing." And finally, God sees sin as enslaving and progressive. Romans 7:23 says, "But I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind, and bringing me into the captivity of the law of sin, which is in my members." So in their captivity, that is a key word. When we sin, it enslaves us, it keeps us captive, and it keeps us away from God. So we're basically enslaving ourselves through sin. So going along with now knowing what sin is, who sins, and stuff like that, a lot of people have asked, well, what about those people who are defined as good people, like Gandhi, or other people who aren't Christians that do good things? Isaiah 64:6 actually references this and says, "But we are all an unclean thing, and all our righteousness are like filthy rags. We all fade as a leaf, and all of our iniquities, like the wind, have taken us away." So even those of us that do righteous deeds, or like Gandhi, where he did great things within his life, even righteousness is an extension of our own selfishness. It's still an extension of sin. Ephesians 2, chapters 8 through 9 says, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast." So even these good works that a lot of people have had who are just working outside under God's authority, while those things aren't necessarily bad, it's never by good works that we earn eternal salvation in God's kingdom. So this brings us to our next point. What is God's response to sin? In Hebrews 10, verses 1 through 4, God says, "For the law, having a shadow of the good things to come, and not the very image of the things, can never, with these same sacrifices, which they offer continually year by year, make those who approach perfect. For then why would they not have ceased to be offered? For the worshippers, once purified, would have had no more consciousness of sins. But in those sacrifices there is a reminder of sins every year. For it is not possible that the blood of bulls and goats could take away sins. Basically, this is looking at the Old Testament handling of sin, what God told the children of Israel how to handle sin. They would offer sacrifices of bulls and goats as atonement for sin. So it was a temporary covering of sin, not a permanent solution. There still was no solution to sin, just a temporary covering, which is why they had to do it every year. So, all of this changed, of course, though, with Jesus. Jesus is God's ultimate response to sin. God knew that we could never fully go through life without having sinned and living a perfect life the way He called us to do. So what did He do? He personally came to us as a human in the form of His Son, Jesus Christ. Matthew 26:28 says, "For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Notice the difference between atonement and forgiveness. Jesus didn't come to temporarily cover sin by living a perfect, sinless life and dying for us at the crucifixion, but He came to forgive sins through that sacrifice, not just to atone for them. So that is the biggest difference. Hebrews 10:17 says, "Then He adds, their sins and their lawless deeds I will remember no more." So even this record of sins that we think, oh, we're going to die and be in front of God at the judgment, and He's still going to weigh our old sins versus our good righteous deeds. That's not how it is. That's not how God sees sin. He says here, and He will remember them no more. That once you've accepted Christ to cover your sins, they just don't exist anymore. And finally, Romans 5 verses 8 through 10 says, "But God demonstrates His own love towards us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, having now been justified by His blood, we shall be saved from the wrath through Him." So the wrath that we bring on ourselves by sinning, God completely covered that. So what's the point of all of this? To go over it, we can see that all of us have sinned and fall short of what God expects of us. Therefore, we are undeserving of going to heaven with God. Our sin separates us from God, and the only way we could be seen as righteous is through Jesus Christ. So not by our works, not by our good things, it's not karma. And then finally, with Jesus having taken the wrath of our sin onto Himself willingly, we are seen as perfectly clean and acceptable through Him.